In February, the crash landing of a Delta connector flight here at Toronto Pearson International Airport was all over the news. But of course, it's not the first accident at this airport in its history. Let's talk about some of the more significant ones. There's been an airport on this site since the late 1930s. I talked about that in my video about getting to and from this airport by rail. There's a magic link up here, and I'll put a link down in the description so you can find it when you've finished watching this video. In all that history, it's not surprising that there have been some accidents here. Before this year, the most recent significant incident occurred on August the 2nd, 2005, when an Air France A340 landing at Pearson overshot the runway, crashed into the ravine of Etobicoke Creek, not far from where I'm standing, caught fire and was destroyed. Thankfully, all 309 people on board survived. So, what happened? It was a dark and stormy afternoon, with swirling, gusty winds and heavy rain. The runway that the plane landed on is 2.7 kilometers long, and normally planes land within the first few hundred meters. But this one didn't touch down until well over a kilometer down the runway, leaving only about 1.5 kilometers for it to slow down. In perfect conditions, this aircraft would only have needed about 1 kilometer, so it would have been okay. But on a wet runway with a tailwind, it could have needed as much as 2 kilometers, and it didn't have that much room. If it had landed where it was supposed to, it would have had enough room. Now, it's not uncommon for planes to float over the runway for a while before touching down, particularly in gusty winds, because the changing winds can affect the lift on the aircraft. But when that happens, the normal procedure is to do a go-around, in which the pilots increase the throttles, fly back up into the air, and circle around and try again. These pilots chose not to do that, and that pilot error was cited in the accident report. Of course, the weather was also cited as a contributing factor. The next crash I want to tell you about took place on June 26, 1978. An Air Canada DC-9 was taking off from what was then the southernmost runway, just a few hundred meters north from where another runway would later be built, that was the runway that was involved in the Air France crash. Much of the way down the runway, one of the plane's tires burst, and by the time the pilot tried to abort takeoff, it was too late. The plane overshot the end of the runway, and much like the Air France flight later, went into the ravine of Etobicoke Creek, not far from where I'm standing. Fortunately, the plane did not catch fire. Unfortunately, out of the 107 people on board, 2 of them died. The accident report found that the pilot reacted too slowly to abort the takeoff. It was only a delay of a few seconds after the tire burst, but with the plane traveling at almost 300 kilometers an hour at that point, it traveled several hundred meters and it didn't have enough room left to stop. Interestingly, that incident report raised concerns about the proximity of the Etobicoke Creek ravine to the end of the runways, foreshadowing a concern that would be raised again in the wake of the Air France crash. On July 5, 1970, an Air Canada DC-8 coming in to land at Pearson ended up crashing here in Brampton, about 10 kilometers north of the airport. If you've ever looked out at the wing of an airplane just after it landed, you might have noticed there are these metal flaps that come up like this from the top of the wing. Those are called spoilers. They interfere with the airflow over the wing, reducing lift and increasing drag, both of which are useful once the plane has landed and is trying to slow down. Air Canada had an official procedure for using the spoilers on the DC-8. During the final approach checklist, which is carried out by whichever pilot is not flying the aircraft, the spoilers are supposed to be armed. Arming them doesn't actually deploy them, but what it does is it sets them to deploy automatically when a sensor in the landing gear detects the weight of the plane has touched down. The 2 pilots on this flight had flown together a number of times, and they agreed that they didn't like the official procedure, but they disagreed on what they did want. So they had an arrangement. Whichever pilot was flying would get it their way. It was the captain who was flying this flight, and what he wanted was not to have the spoilers armed at all, but rather for the co-pilot to deploy them manually once the plane was on the ground. But on this flight, he crossed things up, and he told the co-pilot, do it your way. So, just before the plane was about to touch down, when the captain told the co-pilot to do it his way, which was to arm the spoilers just before touchdown, the co-pilot mistakenly did what the captain normally wanted him to do, which was to deploy the spoilers. This caused the aircraft to crash onto the runway and land quite heavily. As soon as the captain noticed what had happened, he did a go-around, but he wasn't aware of the damage that had been done to his plane. The crash had torn one of the 4 air engines off the wing, and there was fuel streaming out from the wing, and the fuel caught fire. A few minutes later, in the air, a series of explosions took place on that wing, resulting in the other engine on that wing coming off and chunks of the wing being blown off. Aircraft have a high degree of redundancy, including the ability to fly even if one of the engines is missing or not working. But lose a wing and it's game over. The aircraft went into a steep dive and crash landed here in what at the time was a farmer's field. Everybody on board was killed. The accident report, of course, cited pilot error, not just the error of the co-pilot deploying the spoilers instead of arming them, but the error of both pilots of deviating from the official procedure. It additionally made a recommendation that the controls for the spoilers on the airplane should be redesigned so that it was impossible to deploy them while the plane was in the air. This memorial was opened in 2013 at the site of the crash. There are 109 of these light-colored stones, one for each of the victims, and there's a plaque with all of their names. It's sad that so many people have died in plane crashes, but when you think about it, air travel is actually very safe. Yes, when that DC-8 I mentioned crashed, everybody on board died, but several years later, when the DC-9 crashed and went into the ravine with over 100 people on board, only 2 of them died. When the Air France plane crashed and went into the ravine and caught fire, with over 300 people on board, nobody died. And earlier this year, when the Delta Connector flight crashed, lost a wing, flipped over, and caught fire, everyone got out alive. A big reason why air travel is so safe is because of the investigations after every one of these crashes. The investigators try to find out what happened, why, and what can be done to prevent it again. A lot of these lessons learned are written in blood, but they have saved untold lives. Well, I hope you liked this video. If you did, you know what to do. Please like and subscribe.